Hello. This talk is called Examining Cultural Evolution with Contextual Geometric Structures. My name is Dr. Bradley Alisea, and I'm presenting this on behalf of my co-authors Aaron Higgs and Jesse Parent. And there are Twitter handles there in case you're interested in following us. We're from the Orthogonal Research and Education Lab. So, contextual geometric structures are rooted in the notion of sort of spatiality of ideologies and categories. And so one question we can ask is, how do we think about categories or beliefs, or binary oppositions for that matter? And we have some intuitions of this in culture. You see, for example, this is an example of the European Parliament, where we have the left wing and the right wing that are configured in such a way in the seating arrangement here. We also think of this often as coinciding with the qualities of a Gaussian distribution with some sort of spatial direction. So a Gaussian distribution is where the mean is in the middle and the extremes are at the end. And then we think of this in terms of left and right and how this works. But there is a computational alternative to this. And oftentimes this model is wrong. And we'll see how we can overcome some of these problems with this type of conception, but also do this in a computationally rigorous way. So contextual geometric structures are rooted in structuralism. So this is both the Levi-Strauss version of structuralism and post-structuralism, which came after. So in structuralism, cultural relationships are represented as a series of overarching structures. And these are understood as a set of binary oppositions. So like hot and cold, right and left, and so forth. These structures are the key to cultural representation. And so this denotes our relationship with nature, kinship, and the ritual world. Later on, there were some shortcomings of structuralism, so post-structuralism came along, and this is an emphasis on signs. So this definition of signs, which are binary oppositions, but they're also dynamic, so that they change over time. And so do structures and their binary oppositions persist in the same way over time? The post-structuralists would say, no, you have to account for the change. And are they universal? And the post-structuralists would probably also say no. We're not going to talk so much about universality here, but we are going to talk about these aspects of categories and binary oppositions. And finally, the habitus serves as the final piece of inspiration here. And this was, of course, Pierre Bourdieu's idea. Oftentimes, you can view habits as a form of practice, and this comes in the form of rituals or embodied behavior. And this is linked to cultural representation. So this is like a mental schema or some sort of representational schema, where social actors are automata and they behave according to these schema. So actually, if we want to operationalize this, instead of having this just be some exercise in applied mathematics, we want to go back to the brain, where we hypothesize a lot of these representations reside. And in this case, we can see how representations in the brain work. We have different areas of the brain where the representations of sensory information, of thought, of things that, neurons are acting collectively, but they're representing something of a higher order. And so this is often a geometric sort of thing, and we don't really know exactly how these representations work, but we do know that they have this sort of structure where you can build some sort of simple geometric, or sometimes it's a very complex multidimensional geometric representation out of it. And so in this case, we're taking inspiration from this, and we're building these representations in what we call cultural space. So we're able to take things, perceptions, direct perceptions from the environment, and map them to these spaces. And then later, this space, for example, is a sensory space. So it's taking direct perception, it's mapping it to a sensory space, a multimodal space. And then later it will map onto some sort of conceptual space using a similar geometry and higher level concepts. And so this is your sensory representations. And what you notice about the sensory representations down here is you have different cultures that emerge. So you get these different phenomena where hot and cold are sort of like the physical extremes of these categories. And then cultural representations are built within this physical range, but there's also overlap between cultures. So culture A, culture B, and culture C are all represented in this space. And then there's overlap between two of these cultures. So you can mix it up. You can have like the sensory representations, the categorical representations, and then maybe mixes of them, depending on your needs. We also base this on soft or fuzzy classification. So it's important to remember that this isn't like probability. This is much different. There's a membership function on the interval of 0 to 1, so something can be a certain degree of hot, a certain degree of cold, and it's not a probability, so it doesn't require transitivity, distributivity, or symmetry. And so you can see the rules here. Basically, it doesn't follow the typical sort of set theory that we're used to, although you can have overlap and you can have union and things like that in the actual categories within these. So these contextual structures can be of many shapes and dimensions. So you can have two binary oppositions. You can have a binary opposition with a contextual anchor, which is more conceptual. You can have a one tuple, what we call, which is a single sort of thing. It's like a category, but it's also modulated by something. We don't know what, but it's also a category, and so it has this shape. We have a 5 tuple, which is 5 different dimensions here, which all have sort of the attributes of taste or gustation. And we have this 3 tuple with a contextual anchor. So this is a binary opposition with fluctuation as a concept that operates independently of hot and cold. And so we can do all of these. We can mix these in different ways. And another thing to remember is that once you have this sort of category, that there is membership in these two sets, R and G. So this is a space that has it's a binary opposition. And the idea is that your membership is in both R and in G at the same time. So you can have, they don't have to be like linear. They can be, you can have 80% membership in R and maybe 60% membership in G, depending on the context. So it's a bit hard to, it's maybe a bit hard to wrap your head around, but definitely it's more flexible than, say, like a typical mathematical model. And so an example of a soft classification is something like this. I think I showed this before, where you witness a car crash and you have this 3-dimensional or 3-tuple sensory space, and this experience is bounded by this red line, and these are all the membership functions of all the observations you make over a given interval of time. And then eventually, if you compare these with other such representations, they yield cultures that are independent or overlapping. And you could do this. You can do these sorts of representations even more complex. You can take the color. It's not the color spectrum, but it's the CMYK spectrum, which is an attribute of color in the world. And this is a 32-bit representation, so you have C, M, Y, and K all represented on the circle. And so you can actually take, there's a membership function in radians, so it's a degree of membership in one of these categories as you're going around the edge of the circle. And D is present or absent. So D is 0 or 1 in this case, but you could have grades of membership where you're maybe observing a little bit of this color value or a lot of the color value, and you can zoom in and out on the circle. So you can have these, you can recombine the color space in different ways depending on how your agent is perceiving it or your agent is representing it. So you can play around. This is, your decision to make when you're making these in this model, but you can actually modify the model in different ways so that you're representing different things. So you can represent it in a combined CK, combined MY space, or combined CK MY space. So the whole thing is undifferentiated. Your agent maybe isn't recognizing specific components of it. So this, I'd say agent because it could be a computational agent, or it could be a model of what a human is doing, or another animal that you specify. So it's a flexible paradigm. So how do we characterize the evolution of one of these representations? So we know that evolution can be captured by phylogeny and common ancestry. But to be cultural, each representation must also be shared between agents. So sharing introduces reticulations or sort of feedbacks on these phylogenies on an ordered graph. mapping between sensory CGS and categorical CGS, which I mentioned before. This is a sensory CGS. We would then map it to a categorical CGS to understand fully how this evolves over time and then over generations. And then multiple contextual structures can be interlinked into a single individual, creating a complex network. So this is a phylogenetic relationship, and because this is a fuzzy categorization, we have these gray areas around the branches in our phylogeny. We have these three cultures here. They're laid out in a phylogenetic relationship. So C branches off before A and B, and then B branches off from A. But then there's this overlap, and that's represented by a reticulation, which is this area here. It's the union of A and B. And so we can see it's almost like a hybridization event. You also have integrative communication between the automata. So this is an example of how this works. This is a pairwise communication between the two agents. This is adopted from a behavioral economics context, but there's ways that the agents or the agents in the model can trade and exchange information. We also have an interest in modeling linguistic ambiguity and polysemi. So one criticism of this might be, look, you're using these categories, but language is known to be fluid. It has ambiguities. It has multiple meanings for different words. And so we recognize that. And we've done some work modeling this as well. This is an example of polysemi, which means that you have multiple meanings for a single symbol. So this pipe has multiple meanings to different people. And you can actually model this as weak and strong polysemi based on sort of the representation. So I'm not going to get too much into this, but polysemi is derived from specific points in a conceptual space where we take things that are mapped to the sensory space and then map to this conceptual space. So you can have partial identities that are non-transitive anchored by a psychophysical phenomena captured by natural linguistic terms. So we're using just linguistic terms. There's a lot of fluidity in that, and then we use this method to understand that. We can also incorporate change into our models, and so how do we model content in which the scope of reality always changes? In this case, this robot is seeing the Statue of Liberty for the first time. So how does it categorize that? And so we can use things like homeomorphic transformations of the space to sort of model how these new pieces of information can be incorporated. So the shape changes, but we can also add in new axes and new dimensions as we need to. We can also think of CGS as a more generalized cybernetic system. And so we're building these epistemological representations. We need to map from, like, say, a sensory kernel to a conceptual kernel. So this is done in a little bit of an odd way. In the first case here, in portion A here, we populate an isomorphic sensory representation. So this is a soft category space. We create a conceptual kernel of interest, and then we map it back to a sensory kernel. So we have a bunch of concepts. We map it back to the sensory components that we think are involved. Then we have this, what we call a reentrant map, which is borrowed from neuroscience, where we have direct perceptual inputs into the sensory kernel, and then it's mapped to the conceptual kernel. So you have this feedback where you're going from concept to sensory, sort of the hypothesis of what the sensory space looks like, and then with more direct perception information, you're going from that sensory kernel, which is being populated by specific observations, and then it goes back to the conceptual kernel and populates that. So we can also model these as hairball networks. So each of these circles is one of these maps here, A and B, and they're connected by this network. And this is a hairball network, which means it's all-to-all connectivity. It's not pairwise like we saw before, but it's all-to-all. We can use hairball networks or even bipartite networks, which are specific types of networks that we can use to model these phenomena, and then collect statistics about the aggregate behavior of these kernels, and then eventually come up with an idea of what the culture looks like, characterize the culture a little bit more. So our hairball networks, again, these are individual representations that are interconnected. They yield a matrix with a degree of inter-individual shared variance. So this is almost like sexual selection or reproductive selection in terms of seeing which ones are better than others, which ones are more connected than others. We use usually a similarity criterion for determining which ones are connected, preferentially. And so in the bipartite network, this is mapping between sensory kernels and conceptual kernels from different individuals. So this is a loose analogy to crossover rather than reproductive fitness in biological reproduction. We can also look at CGS kernels as a fractal tree. So this is a fractal tree where we have a bunch of these three-dimensional kernels arrayed in a way that's they have different scales, so they increase in their scale, and form this tree. So we can actually use this to embed conceptual classifications at different structural scales. So that could be spatial, but it also could be perceptual scales. We know that there are representations in the brain, for example, that are of different scales, local, global. We also know that space can be integrated in that way. You observe things locally in space, you observe things globally in space, and they're different representations and they have different meanings. So this is another way of getting at these ambiguities in meaning and in the world itself. Smaller sets of concepts are embedded in ordered graphs of a larger set of concepts, and so on and so on. So this is fractal. Finally, we have these logistic maps, which are these tools from complexity theory where you take a difference equation shown here, and you can capture changes in representations over time. You characterize these fractal structures shown before, and other recursive phenomena shown in the phylogenies. And so this is the mathematics of it. You can see that there's these stable states. You have these states that promote fluctuation, and then a chaotic regime here where there's a lot of unpredictable behavior. So we can actually characterize behavior not just over time, not just within a static context, but also sort of the dynamics of it, the change factors. And so this has parallels with similar perspectives. I wanted to mention this before we end because I think that it's important to know where we're not necessarily taking from this, but this is a parallel. These are parallel perspectives. So there's Garden Forest who proposed something called conceptual spaces, and this was something that was, it's more cognitive science oriented. The idea is that there are these concept representing geometries that can bridge connectionist and symbolic perspectives of agent learning. So it's making that same connection there. We also have Falconier and Turner and their idea of conceptual blending, where components of cognition and beliefs are blended at the subconscious level and serve as a representation that engages with the world. And so that's another thing we're kind of trying to do, but in a much different way. And so thank you for your attention.